Welcome to Untold Tales Audio Anthology, written and narrated by Dr. Jeffrey A. Robinson. Dimorphs. The tracker team subdued the poachers without even being noticed. They'd first detected the four-man team of looters from motion detectors that the conservatory had planted deep in the forest. When the intervention team arrived, they stayed out of sight, but launched silent hunter-seeker drones into the dense forest. Using heat-detecting sensors, each drone located and targeted one of the four off-worlders. On Carolyn's silent command, they each shot their targets with taser rounds, which immediately disabled all four team members. Carolyn Domingo and her team then approached the temporary base camp that the off-worlders had set up. From her remote location, she watched as the poachers were bound and gagged. After gathering the interlopers' gear and clearing the campsite, she backtracked their path through the dense woods and confirmed that they had been illegally harvesting the giant Sorocan blood trees. They'd already destroyed 3 trees, but had not yet begun drilling into the 4th one they had targeted. The loss of each of these trees would leave a serious scar in the forest, since each tree stood 80 to 100 feet tall, more than 30 meters, and each supported a canopy of leaves that was just as wide. The trunks of the trees alone measured more than 25 feet, or more than 8 meters across. Carolyn always thought of them as giant bonsai trees with a thick canopy of foliage that loomed overhead like the cap of a giant mushroom. The importance of the trees to the poachers lay in the sap of the giant blood trees, which was highly valued and subsequently drew smugglers and looters like honey attracts flies. Each tree grew 1 or 2 burls each year, which then turned into large curled knots of wood about 3 feet across. If tapped, one could extract up to 20 gallons or 80 liters of sap. After being refined and processed, this would yield 4 to 8 liters of Sorocan elixir, which had the remarkable property of actually reversing the aging process, thus miraculously making people younger. Each 10 cc dose sold for more than $1 million, but as the cost is no barrier to the super-rich, this meant that one could buy 30 years of youth for a mere $10 million. A single tree could thus translate to $200 million to the poachers, and that type of payback made it worth landing on a conservatory-protected world like Antares 4, even if it meant a life sentence in prison if caught. Leaving her location, Carolyn finally approached the tree that the looters had been preparing. Her heart was filled with dread, and her fears were confirmed when she spied the bodies of 3 small Antarans sprawled at the base of the thick trunk. These small Aborigine humanoids typically gathered around these trees, and the hunters had driven off the tiny tribe, killing a few in the process. Damn, thought Carolyn. Safeguarding these trees and these poor primitives has become a full-time job. She grumbled silently to herself, wishing she had more funding and more personnel. Unfortunately, the number of poachers that arrived each year continued to increase. Such incursions now occurred more than twice a year. The fact that this team had remained unnoticed for so long meant that they must have used stealth technologies to slip past the sensors in the small array of satellites orbiting this world. Since Antares 4 only had a provisional protectorate status, it didn't have manned picket ships to patrol nearby space, which gave the world only limited protection from outsiders. Since it was governed as a planetary preserve, there were no cities or towns here. The only habitation for off-worlders consisted of a few base stations the Conservancy had built for its personnel. Thus, anyone who could bypass a few satellites could hide in the dense forests below. Carolyn Domingo watched as the poachers were loaded into a transport and then she dispatched a tracker team to see if they could locate the smuggler's ship. She also assigned a squad to transport the bodies of the dead Antarans to the tribe nearest the main base. The small, semi-intelligent creatures were peaceful and passive and rarely died, so she did not know if they had any burial rites or methods of tending to the remains of their dead. Glancing back at the tracker team that had begun backtracking the path of the poachers, she thought, if the raiders are smart, their ship will have returned to orbit, where they'd try to stay out of sight. Despite the incredible value of the blood tree sap, losing a team in that precious payload was still cheaper than losing a ship with stealth and star-jumping technology. Privately, she doubted that her team would find anything, but they had to look anyway. As the transport took off and rose into the air, Carolyn radioed the main base camp and reported their situation. "Director Domingo here," she said. "We've apprehended the poachers and the intervention team is returning. The second squad has remained on site to search for the intruder's ship." "Thank God you called, Carolyn," said Lisbeth, the communications officer at the main base. "You've got an unexpected guest who's waiting to see you now." That's strange, she thought. We're normally notified more than a month in advance of any authorized ship that comes here. "Who is it?" Carolyn asked. "It's Erastus Duvari, a commissioner from the Conservatory Authority." "Damn," she said to herself. "That's all I need. The only thing worse than smugglers and poachers are politicians." She cursed silently to herself and thought for a moment. Erastus had the reputation of being the most political member of the Planetary Conservatory Council. Moreover, people said he was just a mouthpiece for the big mega-corporations that held all the major mining and development contracts off Earth. Rumors were that he'd been bought and paid for by those big-money concerns and that he didn't give a damn about preserving alien life. He was only interested in exploiting it. His unannounced arrival here could only mean something bad for her and Antares 4. "We're headed back now," said Carolyn. "Tell him that we're 20 minutes out and escort him to a conference room where he can wait, but don't let him talk to anyone, okay?" "Sure, Carolyn," said Lisbeth. "I'll do just that." Carolyn didn't enjoy the ride back, despite the beautiful world that passed by below. Her thoughts turned dark with dread as she worried about what news Erastus was bringing. When her shuttle arrived at the small landing field at the edge of the conservatory station, Carolyn hurried first to her office and took 2 copies of the report she and her team had been preparing. She headed to the main conference room. When she arrived, she found Lisbeth waiting by the door, holding a cup of kava. Lisbeth must have suspected that this would be a tense meeting and had prepared Carolyn's favorite brew for the director. Lisbeth smiled pleasantly as Carolyn took the mug. Carolyn smiled back with an expression of gratitude and appreciation. Then she took one of the copies of the report and handed it to Lisbeth. Whispering silently, Carolyn asked, "Can you send this out immediately to the widest distribution you can manage?" Lisbeth nodded and smiled. Then she hurried away. Carolyn took a single sip of her drink, calming herself, and finally stepped into the conference room. Commissioner Erastus Duvari sat at the end of the long conference table at the far end of the room. He gazed nonchalantly out the large windows of the facility and at the vast expanse of forests that stretched out to the mountains in the distance. He did not acknowledge Carolyn's presence, but simply continued staring out the window. Even though they'd only met twice, Carolyn had already developed an intense dislike for the man. Though she knew him mostly by reputation, her previous encounters with him only confirmed the worst of what she had heard. She regarded him as a predator, a cunning, ruthless adversary who smiled too much and who watched and waited for other people to make mistakes or display weakness. His dark eyes always seemed to hide some hidden purpose, and every motion revealed that he felt he was superior to anyone else in his presence. His perfectly styled hair and expensive suit made him look more dangerous than dignified. Carolyn finally coughed to make her presence known. Erastus turned his head with mock surprise and said, "Ah, Director Domingo, I was beginning to wonder if you were ghosting me." He did not stand. He merely turned his chair to face her. "Oh, Carolyn, please, Commissioner, and I wasn't avoiding you. I was on an intervention mission, apprehending some poachers. I hope you weren't kept waiting too long. I would have been here to greet you, but I wasn't notified of your pending arrival." Erastus paused and finally tilted his head as if amused. With a smile that gave her goosebumps, he then said, "Ah, no matter. You're finally here, and you're probably wondering what the reason is behind this unexpected visit." When Carolyn didn't reply, he continued, "It will undoubtedly interest you that I bring good news, excellent news. The conservatory has finally decided what to do with this awkward little world. They've deliberated for decades, considering dozens of different proposals about what to do with this planet. A world so tiny, yet so rich in potential and untapped resources." Carolyn's teeth tightened, and she began to suspect the worst. While the objective of the Conservatory Authority was to preserve and safeguard alien worlds, and especially intelligent life like that of the native Anterans, they were constantly besieged with demands from Earth-based companies and off-world mining interests to exploit or plunder this place. She worried that whatever Erastus thought was good news would be bad news for her and her teams here on the planet. Grinning triumphantly, he said, "Antares 4 has been in limbo status since the initial colony here failed more than 80 years ago. You and your predecessors here at this station have done nothing more than catalog and study this place. Unfortunately, you've made no substantial case against developing this world. You've merely stalled and obstructed all proposals to make use of the valuable resources here." "But that time is over," he said, his smile suddenly vanishing. "The Council has finally decided what to do with Antares 4. Carolyn's anger rose. "But that's not right. We should have been consulted on any pending decision. Why, we've recently made some remarkable discoveries about life on this world that would clearly justify a continued protectorate status for Antares 4. Standing, Erastus waved his hand dismissively. "It doesn't matter. It's too late now. The Council has removed the provisional protectorate status of this world, except for the aborigines you've grown so fond of. The Council has decided to open up the planet to outside interests who will make use of the wealth of this world that's gone to waste for far too long." Carolyn knew that he meant the systematic harvesting of the blood trees and large-scale strip mining of the rich ore deposits in the nearby mountains. In a decade, the ecosystem here would be in ruins if it remained viable at all. "But you can't do that, Erastus. What will happen to the Anterans?" "That's Commissioner Duvari, Director. I don't believe we've ever been on a first-name basis. But to answer your questions, the Anterans will still be considered a protected species and have been classified as a possible Level 3 intelligence. Our highest priority, of course, will be to safeguard every single one of those creatures, even if they're only slightly more intelligent than chimpanzees or gorillas back on Earth. To ensure their safety, they'll all be gathered into a nice, carefully tended preserve where they'll be cared for forever." Carolyn's mouth opened in shock, and then she said, "But the rest of the planet—" Erastus silenced her by raising his hand in her face and said, "The rest of the planet will be made available to external business enterprises that have nothing but the best interests for this world. Potential proposals have already started arriving from some very interested parties, and a special subcommittee of the Council will be awarding contracts accordingly. I, of course, will be chairing that subcommittee." Carolyn struggled to maintain a professional demeanor. She had to fight the urge to physically assault the slimy snake of a man. Breathing deeply, she tossed the report to Erastus. The folder slid across the smooth table and came to rest just out of reach in front of him. "Well, "Before you sign any of those contracts, you might want to read this," she said. He had to stand to reach the folder and frowned as he opened it. "This is part of the annual report that we make to the Conservancy on Antares 4 each year. That section details recent discoveries about the ecosystem here, and it answers many of the questions about this place that have bothered us since humans arrived here 8 decades ago." Closing the folder, Erastus leaned back in his chair and said, "Not that it matters, but tell me, have you finally decided why the initial colony here failed, and how we might open this place for human habitation?" Dollar signs twinkled in his eyes. "Yes, and as you know, the original attempts to establish a colony here failed when the crops did not grow." Yes, the soil is poisonous," said Erastus. "No, that's not quite correct. The crops died because natural organisms in the soil here act as bacteriophages and eat the bacteria that terrestrial plants require to fix nitrogen. Also, local flora is invasively destructive to Earth-based plants. Crops planted here are overrun and choked out by native species. Terran vegetation just withers and dies. Unfortunately, even after all the colonists were recalled, we never figured out why we couldn't eradicate or neutralize those organisms. Antibiotics and herbicides didn't work, or only had limited effects. In the years since, we've conducted extensive studies on the genetics of the life on this world. We concluded that the carbon-based life on Antares 4 is at least 1 billion years older than life on Earth. All of the species here have far more chromosomes and longer gene strands than their Terran counterparts. Native life here is simply more evolved than Earth species, and frankly, our plants can't compete with them. Indeed, the life on this world appears to be far older than any other carbon-based life forms on any other planets we've visited. This tends to support the progenitor theory of genetic diaspora." Erastus laughed. "Oh my God, that's nonsense. The progenitors are a myth. No evidence has ever been found to confirm their existence." "Actually," countered Carolyn, "there's a general consensus of the scientific community that there was a spacefaring race that seeded many Type M planets across this arm of the galaxy. There's no other possible explanation for how there could be so many planets with life that have DNA structures compatible with our own. The parallel evolution of such similar biologies is statistically impossible. If our analysis is correct, then Antares 4 must have been one of the earliest worlds seeded by the progenitors. And if you want evidence, the very life on this world is all the evidence you'll need." Erastus's voice grew louder. "I mean real evidence. Ruins or the remains of cities, mummified bodies, fossils, or something tangible. Not fantasies based on some questionable statistical analysis and biased conclusions." Carolyn raised her voice to match the commissioner's. "Well, the reason for that is that anything 1 billion years old would have long since disappeared. Look at Earth. Virtually nothing tangible remains of civilizations that are mere 8,000 or 9,000 years old. Nothing except some large piles of rock, which normal weather will eventually grind down to dust and sand. Imagine what would be left after 100,000 years, or 1,000,000. Anything 1 billion years old would be gone by now. And there are ruins. There have been dozens of sites found on a number of moons and planets. There are even some on the moon orbiting this world. Their metal structures so old that they're almost completely covered in moon dust." "I'd hardly call them that," said Erastus. "You might describe them as skeletons or structures that once existed, but you can't claim them to belong to the progenitors. Again, it's all sheer speculation. Every time anybody stumbles across something unexplained, a stone or a pile of rocks, they claim they're remains of this long-gone fictitious race. There's nothing to connect these oddities, and it's far more likely they're associated with many different extinct races. I don't believe anyone's ever found writing or engravings that would identify those sites. They're all just crumbling ruins on cold, airless moons. Your stories are nothing more than fanciful myths that amuse science fiction readers. In any case, I don't care about any of that. A sob story about how DNA exists on multiple worlds doesn't make this planet particularly noteworthy. So unless you've got something more substantive, I think we're done here. I came to inform you about the new status of the world, not to negotiate or argue. Erastus started to stand, but Carolyn set her drink down and slowly walked toward him and said, "Oh, no, there's more you haven't heard. I told you we made a recent discovery, and that's what's in the report in front of you. What we've just discussed has been known and suspected for a while. However, our most recent findings, the ones we've now documented, was going to go to the Conservancy next month, but I'm providing you with an advance copy now." Erastus ignored the report and looked at Carolyn as if she hadn't even spoken. "You really need to read that before you head back," advised Carolyn. For the first time, Erastus's pose wavered. He frowned and picked up the report, but he didn't open it. "Let me explain," said Carolyn. "There have been a number of serious questions about the local ecology that we've never managed to answer, like why we can't transplant flora, such as the blood trees or any other species, even when we use native soil. We've never managed to clone specimens either. All attempts to clone any life on this planet only produces globs of undifferentiated protoplasm. Stranger than that, however, is the fact that the plants don't produce seeds. And animals don't seem to have any gender or genitalia, and we've never seen any evidence that they even mate. In fact, it's been a mystery about how they reproduce. The answer was buried in the genome of different, seemingly unrelated species. Recently, we discovered a large mushroom that grows deep in the forest. Finding it finally gave us the missing clue. When we studied it, we found that the mushroom drops spores, much like those on Earth. But the spores don't grow into mushrooms. Instead, they germinate, and each spore hatches into a tiny insect, like an ant. These ants gather decaying material in the forest around them and bring them back to the mushroom, which feeds the giant fungus and helps it grow. The insects, on the other hand, live for about a season, then die. But a few, those that die in a small pocket of rich soil, grow. But they grow into mushrooms. Erastus frowned. What? That doesn't even make sense. But why does it matter anyway? Because we realize that almost all life forms on this planet are dimorphs. Apparently there was an odd turn in local evolution that occurred hundreds of millions of years ago. "What's a dimorph?" he asked impatiently. Dimorphism is when a species or animal has two different forms. There are many types of dimorphs on Earth. Seasonal dimorphs change over time, like caterpillars turning into butterflies or tadpoles turning into frogs. Sexual dimorphs are more common. For instance, a male peacock has a huge fan-like tail, but females don't. In fact, they look like an entirely different species. In fact, there's a type of terrestrial octopus where the female is 40,000 times larger than the male. "Stop! Stop!" shouted Erastus. "This is bloody nonsense. What does all this biological trivia have to do with what we're talking about? I don't need to hear some stupid biology lesson." "Ah, but you do. So just listen," said Carolyn, leaning closer and softening her voice almost to a whisper. "It's important." Then she deliberately waited until the commissioner started to speak once more, at which point she cut him off. "The reason that many of our most important questions remained unanswered for so long hinges on this discovery. If you'll listen long enough, you'll find out we've even discovered how to breed blood trees." She paused again and watched Erastus's eyes grow wide. She could imagine dollar signs flashing across his eyes. The secret was realizing that all species on this world have two forms, one immobile like a plant, and the other mobile like an insect or animal. The immobile forms give birth to the mobile forms, which then travel away and give birth to plants. It's a biological trick to spread seeds further away than they would occur otherwise. For example, there are vines that climb up trees in the forests, but 1 in 100 vines turns into a snake that slithers away. Later, when the snake eventually dies, a nest of vines grows from its corpse. My favorite is a wildflower called the moon moth daisy. It's a delicate flower with large white petals. However, when you walk through a field of these blossoming plants, all the petals fly away because they're actually winged butterflies. "I don't care what your favorite flower is," barked Erastus. "Just tell me what any of this has to do with breeding blood trees." Straightening up, Carolyn grinned and thought, "Oh, he is not going to like this." As I was saying, when we realized that plant and animal species were paired, we started sampling the genomes of every species we could until we finally found the species that was matched to the Socoran blood trees. You'll never guess what it is. Erastus visibly grew angrier, and his mind raced as he tried to solve Carolyn's riddle. Then slowly his eyes grew wide with horror. "No," he said, "it couldn't be. You don't mean—" "Yes," said Carolyn triumphantly. "The blood trees give birth to a small, bipedal species that we've named the anterans. In fact, it's the burls that the poachers harvest that sometimes turn into these indigenous humanoids. When a tribe of anterans has made their home near a particular tree, and they need to replace someone from their group that has died, they tend to one of the growths that appear on the trees each season. Then, instead of the growth becoming hard and tough, the burl remains soft and supple, eventually bursting and producing an infant anteran." "You can't be serious," said Erastus. "You mean the trees and those primates are related?" "No," answered Carolyn. "Not merely related, they're the same species. They both have identical DNA. One form is just a mature, immobile parent that produces its other form, creatures who are both mobile and moderately intelligent. The anterans exist in two shapes, like a caterpillar and butterfly." Carolyn let this sink in for a while as she imagined Erastus withering inside. "I guess that means you can't harvest the blood trees or kill them, because they're just a different manifestation of the intelligent species that you've just declared as protected. Also, if you conduct any mining or harvesting of other species, you'll have to be very careful not to harm any trees, because you'd be killing an anteran. Oh, and one more thing. Anterans have to remain near those trees. Apparently, they drink the sap that's become renowned for reversing aging, making people younger. That's one reason that deaths among them are so rare. They are apparently very long-lived. Some researchers here speculate that they may be centuries old, or maybe more. In any case, if they're deprived of access to that nectar, they die. And if they all die, there'll be no more blood trees. That means your plan to round up all the anterans and confine them to a reservation or concentration camp won't work. You'll be committing genocide and ensuring that there will never be any new blood trees." Erastus stood and grabbed the folder, saying, "I'm going to read this report more carefully, and I promise I'm going to have the best experts we have on staff to analyze it." Carolyn grinned and said, "Well, since my predecessors and I have studied this planet for 80 years, and few of your staff have ever even visited here, I assure you, we are the experts. But please, take your report." Grabbing the folder, he tucked it under his arm and said, "Oh, in the meantime, I'm classifying this report as confidential, and I forbid you to share it with anyone." Carolyn thought to herself, "He plans on burying the report and preventing anyone else from ever knowing about it." However, instead of being worried, she said with mock distress, "Oh, I'm sorry. None of our reports have ever been classified before. I didn't anticipate this. I'm afraid we've already forwarded advance copies of our annual report to all field offices, news outlets, and more than a dozen peer-reviewed journals as well, where our findings will be widely published." Erastus grew silent, and his face grew red with barely contained fury. "We'll see about that," he said, and then he stormed out of the conference room. For long minutes, Carolyn simply stood alone, wondering what kind of trouble she might have to expect in coming days. She didn't fear for her job. She had plenty of friends in the Conservancy, probably more than the commissioner, and besides, there was really no one who could replace her. Still, Duvari could make things difficult if he wanted to. No, she thought, this is far from over. Some weeks later, Carolyn found herself outside the main base, a short distance from the Antaran tribe that lived nearby. Nothing adverse had happened after Duvari left. Her ploy to get her report published in scientific journals had been squashed by the Conservancy, but it had been disseminated widely enough that it had been noticed. The link between blood trees and the Antarans had even been mentioned in a couple science news media outlets. As a result, there had been an emergency meeting of the Conservancy Council specifically to discuss the matters in the report. Fortunately, the Council had decided to place the entire planet under full protectorate status. That means picket ships would soon arrive to protect the world from poachers and outsiders. Rumors had it that several large space-based corporations were extremely displeased with Commissioner Duvari, since they had apparently paid him handsomely in advance to ensure their contracts would be approved. She also heard that Erastus had been reassigned to work on special projects and no longer was directly involved in any protected worlds. But that might just mean that he was being allowed to save face while he looked for another job. She'd just have to wait and see what happened. Upon reaching the village, a field analyst directed Carolyn toward an open area about 300 meters from the blood tree that the small tribe called home. The analyst then explained that several weeks before, her intervention team had taken the bodies that the poachers had killed and returned them to the nominal head of the nearby tribe. Watching carefully, they discovered that these primitives did, in fact, have rituals associated with burying their dead. No one from the outpost had known about these customs before, since deaths among the Antarans were so rare. The analyst described the ceremony they had witnessed and pointed at 3 graves the villagers had prepared. Growing from each of the graves was a small blood tree sapling. Carolyn smiled, knowing that this event completed the circle of life on this world, and that the fledgling trees would grow into a giant nurturing home for a new tribe of Antarans. "One more thing," said the analyst. "Since we discovered the Antarans were Dimorphs, we stationed AI drones to monitor them more closely. To our surprise, the AIs have confirmed that they have a spoken language that they only use privately. That's why we've never noticed before. This means that they are a species that possesses at least a level 2 intelligence. When the AIs have fully mapped their language, we should be able to converse with them and learn more about them." Carolyn didn't reply, but marveled at how much there was still to learn about this world, and she wondered what stories the Antarans might tell, especially since each of them might be thousands of years old. Thank you for listening. As you know by now, we love our listeners, fans, patrons, and supporters. Please let us know what you think of our podcast and our stories. The best way to do that is to subscribe to our podcast at untold-tales.com. By doing so, you'll be added to our mailing list so you can be notified of upcoming episodes, blogs, and other information. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.